Right now, somewhere in the Amazon basin, it is very dark. The river is black and wide and slow. Insects are doing what insects have done for millions of years, filling the air with sound that rises in layers, like something breathing. And if you were drifting there tonight on the water, looking up through a gap in the canopy, you would probably think, this is untouched, this is wild, this is a place that humans never really changed. That thought feels true, it feels obvious, and it is almost certainly wrong. What we now believe, what archaeology, satellite imaging, soil science and botany are quietly, steadily confirming, is that the Amazon rainforest as it exists today may be, at least in part, a garden, an ancient one, a vast, intricate 10,000-year-old garden left behind by a civilization, or many civilizations that most of the world has never heard of, a world that held somewhere in the range of 10 million people, built landscapes on a scale that rivals anything in the ancient world, and then vanished so completely that later outsiders looked at the same forest and saw nothing but trees. That is the mystery we're going to follow tonight. Slowly, the way you'd follow a river. Here's what makes it so strange. The evidence was always there. It was in the soil, dark, engineered, impossibly fertile earth that doesn't occur naturally anywhere on the planet buried under the roots of trees. It was in the shapes of the land, enormous geometric earthworks, circles and squares and roads stretching for miles, invisible under the canopy until a drought dried the grass and a satellite looked down at the right moment. It was in the forest itself, in the fact that the trees humans would have cultivated, the ones that feed and shelter and heal, grow in patterns too deliberate to be random. The Amazon remembered everything. It just didn't say anything out loud. And so the question this episode keeps asking isn't just who were these people, or how many, or how they lived. The deeper question is this: what does the word wilderness even mean? When people and forest have been shaping each other for thousands of years, when the jungle is the city, and the city grew back into jungle, and you can't always tell where one ends and the other begins. We're going to move through this slowly. We'll follow earthworks and black earth and river kingdoms and managed forests and the catastrophic silence that fell after 1492. There's a lot of ground to cover, and we have all night. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly what I made it for. So settle in, get comfortable, and before you drift, drop a comment if you feel like it. Tell me where you are and what time it is. I genuinely read them. It's always someone in a rainy city at 2 a.m, and someone else eating breakfast in a time zone I had to look up. That never stops being a strange and lovely thing. Now, let's go to the Amazon. Here is the thing about myths. They don't usually start as lies. They start as guesses, made by people who are standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, looking at something they didn't have the tools to understand. And then the guesses get repeated, and then the repetitions get written down, and then the written down versions get taught in universities and cited in papers, and eventually they stop feeling like guesses at all. They feel like facts. They feel like things that have always been known. The myth of the empty Amazon is one of those. For most of the last 5 centuries, the dominant assumption in European thought, in colonial administration, and later in mainstream science, was that the Amazon rainforest simply could not have supported large, settled, complex human populations. The reasoning felt logical on its face. The soils beneath tropical rainforests are notoriously poor. Most of the nutrients in a rainforest aren't sitting in the ground waiting to be farmed. They're locked up in the living biomass itself, in the trees and roots and fungi and leaf litter cycling so fast that clearing the forest for agriculture exposes nothing but pale, exhausted earth that wears out within a few seasons. Anyone who has tried to farm the cleared Amazon knows this. The forest feeds itself, not the ground beneath it. And so scholars, geographers, and anthropologists drew a conclusion that seemed to follow naturally from that fact. If you can't farm it, you can't feed millions of people. If you can't feed millions of people, you don't build cities. If you don't build cities, you have scattered bands of hunter-gatherers moving through an essentially empty wilderness, leaving almost no mark. The Amazon, on this view, was what it appeared to be: ancient, vast, and fundamentally wild. A place where nature had proceeded undisturbed. That conclusion was reinforced almost accidentally by the shape of the landscape itself. The Amazon basin is enormous, roughly the size of the contiguous United States, and for most of the colonial period and well into the modern era, Outsiders could only move through it one way, by river. The rivers were the roads. Everything else was impenetrable canopy, without paths, without clearings, without any obvious sign that civilization had ever been attempted. If you travelled the rivers and saw only small scattered settlements, which is exactly what most European explorers and later scientists did see, it was very easy to conclude that small and scattered was all there had ever been. But here is where the shifting baseline problem enters, quietly, and changes everything. A baseline, in ecological terms, is your reference point, is what you assume normal looks like. And the problem with baselines is that they shift without anyone noticing. Each generation of observers looks at the world as it is when they arrive, and treats that as the natural state. The changes that happened before they got there are invisible to them, because there's no one left to describe what used to be there. When European explorers, missionaries and naturalists moved through the Amazon in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, they were not looking at an ancient, untouched wilderness. They were looking at a post-collapse landscape. They were looking at the aftermath. The populations that had built and maintained and managed this forest had already been devastated by disease, by slaving, by the cascade of disruptions that followed 1492. We'll get into that in detail later. But the important point here is this. The observers who described the Amazon as essentially empty arrived after the emptying. They mistook a wound for a baseline. They mistook a silence for proof that no one had ever spoken. The rubber boom of the late 19th and early 20th centuries made this worse, in ways that are easy to overlook. The rubber trade didn't just extract latex. It destroyed remaining indigenous communities through violence, forced labour and displacement on a scale that is still difficult to fully document. By the time trained anthropologists and archaeologists began making serious attempts to study Amazonian cultures in the 20th century, many of the living cultures that might have explained what the landscape meant were gone, disrupted, or surviving in fragments far from their original territories. The witnesses had been silenced, and the silence was taken for evidence of absence. Now scholars debate the numbers. They have debated them for decades, and they will continue to. Estimates for the pre-contact population of the Amazon basin range from the very conservative, a few 100,000, to figures that some researchers have pushed toward 10 or 12 million. There is no consensus. There probably won't be one for a long time because the evidence is fragmentary, contested, and spread across a landscape the size of a continent. Anyone who tells you they know the exact number with confidence is telling you something the archaeology cannot yet support. But here is what is no longer seriously in dispute. The idea that the entire basin was thinly populated wilderness is wrong, or at least it is far too simple. In certain regions, along major rivers, around floodplain lake systems, in areas where the mysterious dark earth we'll talk about later begins to appear, there is clear evidence of populations that were substantial, settled, and engaged in landscape modification on a remarkable scale. Whether those populations were organized into something like cities or something more like large regional networks of villages is one of the central debates in the field right now, and it's a genuinely interesting one. Because those two things look very different on the ground, but they might not be so different in terms of what they mean. 1,000 small villages trading with each other, managing the same forest together, connected by rivers and kinship and shared agricultural knowledge, that might not look like a city when you're standing in the middle of it. But it might function like one. That tension between the image of isolated, scattered settlements and the evidence for coordinated, large-scale landscape change is the thread we're going to follow through this whole episode, and the only way to follow it honestly is to separate the romantic stories, both the romantic story of the noble savage living in untouched nature, and the romantic story of a hidden Amazonian empire with gold and pyramids, from the actual measurable traces that are still sitting in the ground and the soil and the trees. The traces are strange enough on their own. They don't need embellishment. So let's start with what's underneath. Before we can talk about what people built in the Amazon, we have to ask a more fundamental question. How did anyone get there in the first place? The answer is older than most people expect, and more complicated. The standard story of human arrival in the Americas goes something like this. People crossed a land bridge from Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age, roughly 15,000 years ago, when sea levels were low enough to expose a corridor of land across what is now the Bering Strait. They moved south. They spread. They populated a hemisphere. That story is not wrong exactly. but it is probably incomplete, because the genetic and archaeological evidence from South America keeps producing anomalies, sites that are older than they should be, skull shapes that don't match later populations, DNA signatures that suggest the story of arrival was messier, more layered, maybe involving multiple waves of people from different source populations in Asia, arriving at different times by different routes. There is even a hypothesis, controversial and not yet settled, that some coastal migration happened earlier, people moving south along Pacific shorelines by boat, exploiting the rich resources of kelp forests and river mouths long before the inland routes opened up. What we can say, without much dispute, is that humans were present in the broader Amazon region by at least 13,000 years ago, and possibly earlier. Sites in Brazil and Venezuela have produced dates that push uncomfortably against the conventional timeline. Whether those dates hold up under scrutiny is still being debated. But the direction of the evidence is clear enough. People arrived early, adapted fast, and the Amazon basin was not a late and reluctant footnote in the story of human settlement. It was part of the story from near the beginning, and what they found when they arrived was not one environment, it was dozens. The Amazon basin contains floodplains that flood for months at a time and then recede to reveal rich, silted soils. It contains stable upland forests where the canopy is dense and the undergrowth is deep and the game is scattered but present. It contains savanna edges, gallery forests running along rivers into drier country, palm swamps, blackwater rivers stained dark with tannins, clearwater rivers running cold off ancient highlands. Each of these environments offered different resources and demanded different knowledge to use them well. Early peoples adapted to this variation the way humans always do, slowly, through accumulated failure and success, through the kind of patient observation that doesn't get written down but gets passed on. They learned which river fish ran, when and where. They learned which forest fruits were edible, and which were poisonous in small amounts, and medicinal in smaller amounts. They learned the floods, not as disasters to be escaped, but as cycles to be read and worked with. When the waters rose, the fish moved into the forest. When the waters fell, they concentrated in lakes and channels and became almost impossibly easy to catch. This is not a picture of people struggling against a difficult environment. It is a picture of people who understood their environment deeply enough to live within it, rather than despite it. And here is where something important begins. Quietly, long before anyone builds anything large enough to see from the air, people start to tend. They don't farm, not yet, not in any way that would look like farming to modern eyes. But they begin to curate. They carry useful plants with them when they move. They transplant fruit trees near campsites. They burn selectively to encourage the growth of species they prefer. They protect certain plants and pull out others. Over generations, without any single person deciding to do it, the forest around places where people live begins to look different from the forest where no one lives. More edible, more useful, more structured, in ways so subtle you might walk through it and see nothing but wild trees. This is called forest gardening, or sometimes low-intensity cultivation, and it is one of the most consequential things that ever happened in the Amazon, precisely because it happened so slowly that it left almost no dramatic evidence. No sudden transition layer in the soil. No moment you can point to and say, here is where agriculture began. Just a gradual deepening of the relationship between people and plants, stretching across thousands of years. The soils made this complicated, for reasons we touched on in the last section. Most Amazonian upland soils are old and weathered, and poor in the nutrients plants need to grow fast and produce abundantly. The tropical rains that fall in such extraordinary volumes leach nutrients downward, out of reach of shallow roots. This is why the forest feeds itself from above, from decomposing leaves and falling wood and fungal networks, rather than from below. Any attempt to clear the forest and expose that soil to sun and rain tends to exhaust it quickly. This is not a small obstacle. It is a fundamental ecological constraint. And yet people stayed, and populations over time grew, which means they were finding solutions. Not by conquering the soil, but by changing it, by working around it, by learning village by village, generation by generation, that certain combinations of practices could produce something that raw Amazonian earth could not. One more thing is worth holding on to before we go further. This was never one people with one solution. The Amazon basin contains extraordinary cultural and linguistic diversity, hundreds of distinct languages belonging to dozens of unrelated language families, lifeways that varied as much as the environments that shaped them. There was no Amazon civilization, singular. There were Amazonian civilizations, plural, each adapted to its own stretch of river and forest and flood. And that diversity was itself a kind of achievement. It meant that knowledge accumulated in many places, in many forms, ready to be drawn on when the conditions finally favoured something larger, that something larger was coming. But first, there was the question of the soil. If you could sink down through the forest floor of the central Amazon, layer by layer, most of what you'd pass through would be disappointing from a farmer's point of view. A thin skin of leaves and roots on top, busy and alive. Then, almost immediately, pale, exhausted clays, iron-rich, sometimes stained red or yellow, but nutritionally poor, soil that looks like it should grow anything, and in fact can barely grow crops for a few years after clearing, unless you keep feeding it. It's like discovering that beneath a lush banquet table there is almost no pantry at all, and then, scattered across this vast basin, you hit something that should not be there. A band of soil, sometimes a metre thick, sometimes more, dark, almost black, packed with charcoal flecks, full of pottery fragments, bones, the microscopic remains of food and ash and human waste. Soil that, unlike almost everything around it, holds nutrients and keeps them. Scientists measure its fertility, and over, it comes back richer than neighbouring ground by an order of magnitude. In some places it rivals good temperate farmland. The people who live on it today have a name for it: terra preta, black earth. Terra preta is one of the clearest clues that the Amazon was not just used but engineered. It is not a natural soil. It is anthropogenic, human-made, built up slowly through the ordinary repeated acts of living in one place and paying attention to what happens to your waste. The contrast with the surrounding earth is so stark that it can be seen in a single shovel slice. On one side, the dull yellowish clay of typical upland Amazonia. On the other, a sudden dark richness, crumbly and almost sweet-smelling, even after centuries. Local farmers notice it immediately. Crops planted on terra preta grow better, stay green longer, need less fertilizer. They will sometimes map their fields by colour. Here, good black earth. There, useless red dirt. For a long time, outsiders did not know what to make of these patches. Early European chronicles mention Indian black earth, but their authors were more interested in gold and souls than in soils. Later, as the Amazon was folded into the idea of pristine wilderness, many researchers assumed these dark zones were natural accidents, maybe flood deposits, maybe the remnants of some unique geological process. But the closer archaeologists and soil scientists looked, the less natural they appeared. Terra preta contains enormous amounts of charcoal, not the grey fluffy ash of a campfire, but dense carbon-rich fragments often called biochar. It contains the broken remains of pottery, sometimes in such abundance that it looks as if entire villages' worth of broken pots had been swept into the earth. It contains fish bones, mammal bones, plant residues, traces of human excrement and kitchen waste. Under the microscope it is full of microscopic charcoal particles, bits of bone, and an unusually complex microbial community. This is not what random forest fires leave behind. This is what a long-lived village midden looks like when the village has been gone for 1,000 years. The recipe, as far as we can reconstruct it, is simple in ingredients and subtle in practice. You start with the worst soil you can imagine. You add charcoal from controlled low-oxygen burns. Fires designed not to flare up and vanish, but to smoulder and convert wood into a stable, almost inert carbon skeleton. You add organic waste. Food scraps, peelings, fish heads, leaves from harvest, manure. You toss in broken pots which slowly release minerals and help with structure. You repeat this over and over for generations. Then you wait. Over decades and centuries, something that is not quite composting and not quite geology happens. The charcoal, with its enormous internal surface area, acts like a sponge and a scaffold. It holds onto nutrients that would otherwise be leached away by tropical rains. It houses bacteria and fungi that help break down organic matter and slowly release nutrients in forms plants can use. It locks up carbon in stable forms that can persist for thousands of years. The result is a self-reinforcing system. Once enough black earth has accumulated, it can sustain high levels of plant growth without collapsing. Farmers can plant crops, harvest them, return the residues, and the soil stays fertile or even improves. In an environment where most soils are like sieves, terra preta behaves like a reservoir. We do not have written manuals from the people who made these soils. There is no surviving Amazonian text that says, to make good black earth, do the following. Instead, we have patterns. Terra preta tends to cluster along rivers, on bluffs above floodplains, on ridges and terraces that would make good dwelling sites. Its patches often coincide with other archaeological evidence of human presence. Post-holies, house floors, burial grounds, artifacts. In some regions, black earth zones form rings and ovals hundreds of meters across, suggesting substantial long-occupied settlements. In others, they form strings along old river courses, like beads. This does not mean every spot of terra preta marks a city. That word brings too much baggage. Stone walls and central squares and rulers in headdresses. Some black earth patches may reflect small hamlets, occupied and then revisited over centuries. Others may be special purpose sites, fishing camps, ceremonial grounds, places where people gathered seasonally to process abundant resources and left behind mountains of waste that, over time, became soil. What they all point to, though, is stability. Terra preta is not something you create in a season or two. To build up a meter-thick layer can take hundreds of years. That implies people coming back to the same place again and again, or staying there continuously, long enough for the accumulated debris of daily life to transform the ground itself. And that stability has implications. If you are investing labour into building soil that will be rich in 100 years, you are thinking beyond the next harvest. You're imagining that your children or grandchildren, or their children, will still be here to enjoy it. You are planning. To maintain the process, you need a steady stream of organic input. Crop residues, household waste, manure. That implies fields, gardens, domestic animals, or at least managed hunting and fishing that produce large, regular loads of material. You need organised burning practices, fires set deliberately, at controlled temperatures, to produce charcoal rather than ash. You need people who know when to burn, what material to use, how to combine layers, when to rest a patch. All of this suggests not just technical knowledge, but social coordination. Who decides where the waste goes? Who manages the hearths and pits that produce charcoal? How are fields rotated, fallowed, or shared? These are questions of labour and property, of custom and rule. The soils themselves do not answer them, but they tell us that answers had to exist. There is debate, and it is healthy. Some researchers argue that terra preta was a deliberate conscious technology, a kind of slow-motion soil engineering fully understood by its makers. Others think it may have begun as an accident of settlement, the natural result of dumping waste in the same place, and only later became something people recognized and perhaps refined. It is possible, even likely, that both are true in different regions and times. The one thing that seems clear is that black earth is not a trivial byproduct. It underpins the possibility of supporting large, dense populations away from river floodplains in a landscape that, left alone, does not like to feed many humans in one spot for very long. Today, modern farmers are still using these ancient soils. In parts of Brazil, terra preta is so prized that people dig it up and sell it in bags. Plots that happen to sit on black earth often sustain higher yields, with fewer inputs than their neighbours. In some places, old terra preta fields are being farmed continuously after centuries of use, a quiet testament to their resilience. Scientists have taken notice. The discovery that ancient Amazonians effectively invented a durable, high-fertility soil in the heart of a tropical rainforest has fed into modern research on biochar, carbon sequestration, and sustainable agriculture. If you can recreate some of the properties of terra preta, you can, in principle, improve poor soils, reduce fertilizer runoff, and lock carbon away for centuries instead of releasing it into the atmosphere. Experiments around the world are trying to do just that, mixing charred plant matter with compost, testing different feedstocks and burn temperatures, studying how microbial communities respond. But even the most enthusiastic researchers admit that we have not yet perfectly replicated what unknown farmers achieved thousands of years ago with earth ovens and village dumps. The exact recipes, the rhythms of burning and burying and planting, the cultural knowledge that animated those acts, these remain partly mysterious. What we do have is the outcome sitting quietly in the ground, islands of fertility scattered across one of the least inherently fertile tropical landscapes on Earth. Each one is a fossilized memory of people staying put, eating, discarding, tending fires, raising children, adjusting their practices and watching, over generations, as the soil beneath their feet slowly turned black and generous. And those soils were only one piece of a larger transformation, because once you can reliably feed people in one place without exhausting the land, other possibilities open: more permanent houses, more elaborate earthworks, new forms of ritual and authority. To see those, we have to look not just down into the dirt, but out across the landscape, where lines and shapes hide beneath the trees, waiting for the right light and the right questions to bring them back into view. Once you know to look for human fingerprints in the soil, it becomes harder to believe that the forest above it was ever truly untouched. And then you start to see the shapes. For a long time, they were mostly invisible. Hidden under canopy, softened by centuries of rain and roots, they lay there as faint rises and hollows, the kind of thing you might walk across 100 times and never notice. A slightly straighter line in the undergrowth, a ditch that doesn't quite follow the slope, a curious circular depression where no obvious tree has fallen. It took chainsaws and tractors to begin revealing them. In the late 20th century, as ranches and soy fields expanded into the southern and western Amazon, especially in Acre, Rondonia, Mato Grosso, and into Bolivia, large tracts of forest were cleared. From the ground, the new pastures looked raw and empty. But from small plains, and later from satellite imagery, something startling appeared. Perfect geometry, circles, squares, rectangles bigger than football fields, pairs of shapes linked by long, straight ditches, complex designs where one circle overlaps another, or a square is inscribed within a ring. In some clusters, dozens of these forms lie within a few kilometers of each other, like a buried constellation. Archaeologists call them geoglyphs, large figures cut into the earth, defined not by stone walls but by voids, ditches, embankments, and levelled platforms. A typical example in Acre might be a square, 150 metres on a side, its corners oriented toward the cardinal directions. Around it runs a ditch 2 or 3 metres deep, with the earth thrown up to form a low outer embankment. A straight causeway, another ditch with raised edges, runs from the square to a circle of similar size a few hundred metres away. Sometimes the causeways cross like a grid. Sometimes they fan out, tying multiple enclosures together. In other places the shapes are gentler, ovals, U-shaped forms that open toward a distant hill or river, parallel ditches that might once have framed a road, low elongated mounds that look, from the air, like the remnants of platforms or causeways across seasonally wet ground. All of this in what, until a few decades ago, many people assumed was an eternal undisturbed forest. The age of these earthworks varies by region, and the dates are still being refined. Many of the best-known geoglyphs in the southern Amazon seem to have been built between about 2,000 and 700 years ago, though there are hints of earlier activity in some places. Some were probably in use when the first Europeans arrived on the coast of South America, even if those particular travellers never saw them. What were they for? The answers are tentative and likely multiple. Some researchers see defensive potential. A deep ditch with an outer embankment can slow movement, channel traffic, and provide a line of sight. In landscapes where conflicts between groups did occur, an enclosure with controlled entry points would have been valuable. But these ditches are usually not high-walled fortresses. They are more like low, encircling frames. They might have deterred casual raiding, but they would not have stopped a determined attack on their own. Others emphasize water. In a region with intense rains and seasonal flooding, carefully dug ditches can drain excess water away from a central area, or, just as importantly, hold it. Some geoglyphs sit on slight rises above wetter ground, their ditches perhaps drawing off seasonal pooling to keep interior spaces firm. In flatter areas, complex networks of ditches may have connected to broader systems of channels and ponds, part of a larger strategy to manage wetlands. Many archaeologists suspect these were also social and ceremonial spaces. The shapes are often too large and too regular to be merely utilitarian. Their construction would have required planning, labour and coordination, people agreeing on where to dig, how wide, how deep. Once built, they provided enclosed open areas, sometimes hundreds of metres across, with clear boundaries and maybe sight lines to particular horizons. Imagine such a space not as an empty pasture, but as a place where people gathered. The embankment becomes a low ring on which people can sit or stand. The entry causeways become processional routes. A central cleared platform might host rituals, feasts, negotiations between groups that otherwise lived scattered in small hamlets. Children run along the ditch edges. Elders watch the sky from the corners of a perfect square, noting where the sun rises at certain times of year. Some sites may have marked territory, visible statements, once the forest canopy was lower or more open, that this place belongs to us. Others might have served as landmarks along routes linking communities, waypoints on journeys that could take days by foot or canoe. When you zoom out, especially with modern remote sensing, you start to see that many of these earthworks are not isolated curiosities. They cluster along ridges and river interfluves, align with streams and ancient courses of water, and sometimes repeat similar shapes over wide areas. The impression is not of random doodling on the earth, but of regional traditions, different regions, different styles, all variations on a shared habit of reshaping ground. New technologies have sharpened that picture. Aerial photographs taken in the dry season first made the geometry obvious, dark ditches traced by shadows in pale pasture grasses. Satellite imagery expanded the search, revealing more squares and circles in fragmented forest and farmland. Then came LiDAR, light detection and ranging, fired from aircraft, which can strip away the vegetation in a digital sense and reveal the underlying topography in fine detail. With it, archaeologists have begun to see additional earthworks hidden even under intact forest. Terraces, mounds, ditch networks that never felt the bite of a chainsaw. LiDAR has also highlighted something else: variety. Not all earthworks are geoglyphs in the narrow sense. In parts of the Bolivian and southwestern Amazonian lowlands, for example, the most striking features are not isolated circles and squares, but vast systems of raised fields and canals. Here, instead of carving shapes into relatively dry ground, people seem to have done the opposite. They lifted the ground itself. In seasonal wetlands and flood-prone savannas, long, narrow mounds of earth, sometimes stretching for hundreds of meters, run in parallel lines separated by shallow canals. The fields rise only a meter or so above the surrounding floodplain, but that can be enough. In the wet season, the canals fill with water and fish. The raised beds stay comparatively dry, their soils warmer, their roots better aerated. In the dry season, moisture lingers longer in the canals and seeps back toward the fields. Some of these raised field complexes are almost bewildering in scale. A quilt of linear and checkerboard patterns, intersected by straight causeways and curving channels stretching across square kilometers of lowlands that, to a casual observer, might look like monotonous swamp. These constructions solve several problems at once. They tame unpredictable water levels. They concentrate nutrients where crops can use them. They provide a built-in irrigation and drainage system without metal pipes, just gravity and careful shaping of land. They create micro-habitats, edges between wet and dry, that boost biodiversity and resource options. Fish, snails, aquatic plants, birds, and terrestrial crops all in close proximity. What exactly grew on these fields is still a topic of research. Maize, manioc, sweet potatoes, and local root crops have all been proposed in different regions and time periods. In some cases, the fields may have supported rotating combinations of crops and fallow vegetation. The important point is not the specific crop list, but the ingenuity of making wetlands reliably productive for humans year after year. Taken together, the ditches, embankments, causeways, terraces, and raised fields of the Amazon point to a consistent theme. People were not just adapting to the forest and its waters, they were reorganizing them. This does not mean that every square was a temple, or every canal part of a master plan. Functions probably shifted over time. A ditch that began as a drainage channel might later serve as a boundary. A ceremonial earthwork could double as a safe place to camp during floods. Some sites might have been abandoned and then reoccupied, their meanings changing with each generation. And archaeologists do not always agree. One researcher looks at an enclosure and sees fortification. Another sees a water management device. A third sees a ritual plaza. Sometimes different parts of the same site might support all three interpretations. The forest has had many centuries to blur sharp edges and erase surface clues. Still, if you stand on one of these earthen causeways in your mind, before the forest came back, certain possibilities feel very close. It is late evening at the start of the dry season. The air is cooling, insects rising in thin, wavering clouds over the nearby canals. Along the straight, packed earth road, people walk in small groups carrying baskets, drums, pots of fermented drink. Torches flicker, casting moving bands of light on the low embankments, picking out the curve of a circular ditch ahead. As you approach the geoglyph, the land dips gently, then rises onto the outer ring. Inside, the ground is level, cleared of tall vegetation. You can see people from neighbouring settlements, faces familiar and strange, gathering in clusters, greeting one another. Children run along the rim, silhouetted for a moment against the sky. Somewhere, someone begins a song that everyone knows. The geometry, laid out in earth and ditch, organises the space without shouting. It tells people where to walk, where to sit, where to face. It turns a patch of land into a place of meaning. Much later, forests will grow over it. Roots will crumble the embankments. Leaves will soften the angles, but the shape will persist, just enough for satellites and laser pulses and careful eyes to find it again. These earthworks, like terra preta, are part of a quiet but profound message. The Amazon was not a blank canvas. It was a landscape inscribed and reinscribed by human hands, in forms that could hold water, food, and memory. And where there are ditches and fields and gathering places, there are usually rivers nearby. Rivers that were not just highways, but the pulsing heart of entire social worlds. To follow those currents, we have to leave the upland clearings and descend toward the floodplains, where a different kind of engineering waited in the shallows. Follow the slope of those causeways downward, and sooner or later you reach what, in the Amazon, is the real centre of gravity. The rivers. Not just the big names you see on maps, the Amazon, the Madeira, the Negro, the Tapajos, but the whole branching network, down to creeks you could step across in the dry season, and channels that vanish entirely when the water drops. Together they form something like a circulatory system. If the upland earthworks were the bones of ancient societies, the rivers were the veins and arteries. For the people who lived here, water was not an obstacle. It was the main road. In a world with no pack animals, no wheels, and forests so dense that overland travel could be slow and exhausting, a dugout canoe on a flooded river was an almost miraculous machine. 1 or 2 people with paddles could move hundreds of kilograms of goods. They could travel tens or even hundreds of kilometres in a few days, riding currents one way, hugging the banks and eddies on the return. The big rivers, especially along the central Amazon, the Madeira, the Solimois, were like multi-lane highways. Seasonal flood pulses widened them, joined them with side channels and backwaters, opened shortcuts that didn't exist at lower water. Smaller tributaries were the local streets, connecting interior settlements to the main flow. Along these liquid roads moved more than people: stone from distant outcrops, ceramics in distinct regional styles, feathers from birds that lived only in specific parts of the forest, salt, resins, maybe even ideas about how to build a ditch or which plants to cultivate on a raised field. Where these currents met, things concentrated: resources, people, and power. To understand why, you have to look at the floodplain itself. Once a year, in most parts of the basin, the rivers rise, slowly, then more rapidly, fed by rains that may be falling hundreds of kilometres away. Channels that were modest ribbons of water in the low water months begin to swell. Sandbars disappear. Dark water seeps into the forest, flooding between tree trunks, filling lakes and depressions, turning whole swaths of land into a maze of channels and islands. To an outsider, this can look like chaos. To people who grew up here, it is a calendar. The timing of planting, the location of temporary camps, fishing strategies, hunting routes, the very shape of daily life, all key into this pulse. When the water is lowest, exposed bars and levees become gardens. Women plant quick-growing crops: maize, beans, squash, vegetables, in soils newly refreshed by silt. Men repair canoes, check fishing gear, maybe burn small patches of higher ground to encourage certain plants. As the water begins to rise, attention shifts. Certain fish species move upriver in vast, shimmering runs. Others migrate sideways out of the main channel and into the flooded forest to feed on fruits and seeds. Turtles crawl onto newly exposed banks to lay eggs, then later retreat to deeper water when levels climb. Palm trees along the margins drop heavy clusters of fruit into the shallows, where fish and humans alike can harvest them. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence suggests that ancient floodplain communities were expert at reading and using this seasonal abundance. Shell middens, heaps of discarded river snail and clamshells, accumulate on slightly higher ground, sometimes meters deep, marking places where people regularly processed aquatic foods. Layers of charred turtle shells and fish bones appear in floodplain sites, mixed with charcoal and ceramic fragments, hinting at repeated seasonal occupation. In some regions, the remains of low mounds and levelled platforms near backwater lakes suggest deliberate choice of camp and village locations to balance access to water, with a margin of safety from the highest floods. Life here was not just about taking what the river offered. People were shaping the waters themselves. One set of clues comes from fish. The Amazon today holds an astonishing diversity of fish species, hundreds in a single river system. Pre-contact peoples knew this intimately. They recognized which fish moved where, at what water levels, in which moon phases. They built on that knowledge. Weirs, low barriers built of earth, stone or wood, could be placed across small channels or at the mouths of floodplain lakes. During certain seasons, as water levels fell or fish moved between habitats, these structures would concentrate them in predictable places. Archaeologists have identified linear features and small embankments in some seasonally flooded regions that may be remnants of such systems, though erosion and sedimentation have blurred many details. Beyond weirs, there are hints of more complex fish management. Ethnographic accounts from some Amazonian groups describe the use of semi-permanent ponds, sometimes connected to larger water bodies by controllable channels. In these, people could hold fish for days or weeks, fattening them on fruit and plant waste, ensuring a steady supply for feasts or lean times. There is ongoing debate about how far back in time such practices go, but the basic logic is ancient. Turn a wild migration into a partly domesticated resource. Preservation extended the reach of this abundance. Fish could be smoked over slow fires until dry and hard, then stored for months. Turtles and their eggs could be processed in similar ways. One early European observer described great piles of smoked fish in riverside towns, enough to feed many people for a long time. While we have to treat such accounts cautiously, they align with what the ecology would allow, short bursts of extreme plenty, turned by human labour and knowledge into longer periods of security. Even without metal hooks or nets, these river societies had technologies that turned the flood pulse into a kind of watery harvest cycle. Where resources concentrate, so do people. Along certain major river corridors, the central Amazon, parts of the Madeira and Solimoes, stretches of the Xingu and Tapajos, archaeologists are finding dense clusters of sites, mounds, terra preta patches, ceramic-rich soils, and sometimes more substantial earthworks close to the channels. Instead of a single huge city surrounded by emptiness, the pattern looks more like chains of towns and large villages, spaced at intervals along the banks and levees, linked by daily canoe travel. Some researchers talk about linear populations, tens or hundreds of thousands of people spread out like beads on a string, following the river's curves for hundreds of kilometres. In such landscapes, urban starts to mean something different. Not stone walls and tight city blocks, but an almost continuous ribbon of habitation, gardens, orchards, house clusters, ceremonial spaces, fish weirs, all woven along the high ground that marks the river's edges. Was political power in these river belts equally continuous? That part is harder to see. There are signs of complexity. Large platform mounds on some floodplain margins hint at central places, perhaps chiefly seats, ritual centres, or both. Distinct regional ceramic styles suggest spheres of influence or identity that stretched for long distances along particular rivers. Certain prestige goods, fine polychrome pottery, rare stones, elaborate featherwork, appear far from their points of origin, implying organised exchange rather than random wandering. Such patterns invite words like chiefdom and river kingdom. It is plausible that along some major channels, paramount leaders emerged, able to mobilise labour for earthworks, coordinate multi-village rituals, and perhaps direct raids or enforce tribute. Water makes this easier and harder at the same time. Easier because canoes carry warriors and envoys quickly. A group that controls a stretch of river, especially a bottleneck like a rapids or the mouth of a big tributary, can in theory tax or threaten those who pass. Harder, because the same fluid connections allow people to slip away, found new communities upstream or on a side channel or shift allegiance. Power could travel quickly, but so could dissent. We can imagine, cautiously, a politics shaped by currents, alliances sealed at seasonal gatherings when waters were high and everyone could reach the same ceremonial centre, raiding parties moving silently by night, aiming not to conquer permanent cities but to capture people, seize stored fish or manioc, assert dominance, marriage exchanges negotiated up and down river, weaving distant villages into networks of kinship that could buffer conflict and enable trade. European chronicles, centuries later, describe something like this along parts of the Amazon: hierarchies, tribute in fish and forest goods, riverine alliances and enmities. But those accounts were written after epidemics had already torn through the region, unmaking older patterns. When we look further back with archaeology, the outlines are fainter, more fragmentary. Some stretches of river show dense, long-lived occupation and big constructions, consistent with stronger political integration. Others, equally rich in resources, have more modest remains, suggesting looser, more local organisation. It may be that different river kingdoms rose and fell over centuries, their centres shifting with climate changes, trade routes and social upheavals. The honest answer is that the full map of Amazonian river politics is still being drawn, one survey, one excavated mound, one LiDAR scan at a time. What is clear is that the floodplains were not empty backdrops. They were engineered, inhabited, contested spaces. People timed their lives to the breathing of the waters, turned migrations of fish into managed abundance, built long ribbons of settlement along the edges of channels, and used those same channels to move stories, goods, and power. When you drift along a modern Amazonian river at dusk, seeing only scattered lights of present-day communities, it is tempting to imagine it has always been that quiet. The evidence suggests otherwise. Once, many more fires likely burned along these banks. Many more canoes slipped through these currents. Much louder conversations echoed between levee and water, and yet even this riverine world was only part of the story. For beyond the floodplains, stretching back into what now looks like endless forest, lay another kind of human landscape, one where trees themselves have been coaxed, selected, and rearranged over generations, turning whole regions into something closer to vast, living orchards than untouched jungle. To see that, we have to leave the open channels and travel into the shade, into the managed forest. Leave the river behind for a moment. Canoe pulled up on a muddy bank, hull tilted to drain. A narrow path climbing away from the sound of water into thicker shade. The air changes as you walk. Less glare, more filtered green. Calls of riverbirds fade, replaced by the softer clicks and buzzes of the understory. To an unfamiliar eye, this looks like forest in the usual sense of the word. Trees crowding overhead, vines, leaf litter, no neat rows, no straight lines. But to the people who lived here, this was not just forest. It was more like an enormous, slow-moving orchard. Over the last few decades, botanists and archaeologists have been comparing plant distributions across the basin with known patterns of ancient settlement. What keeps appearing is a kind of ghostly fingerprint. Useful species, especially trees and palms, are more common near old habitation sites, earthworks, and terra preta patches than they are in more remote, less disturbed areas. It is as if someone had walked through huge swaths of the Amazon, century after century, quietly favouring certain plants and ignoring others, until the forest itself changed character. The process is simple in principle, powerful in effect. Imagine you're a family living on a low ridge a few kilometres from the main river. You plant fields of manioc and maize in cleared patches closer to home, but you also move through the surrounding woods every day to hunt, to gather fruit, to cut firewood, to collect medicines. When you find a tree that gives particularly good fruit, you don't just strip it and walk away. You might clear a bit of competing vegetation around its base, letting more light reach the crown. You might spare its seedlings when you burn or garden nearby. You might carry a few seeds or nuts back toward your house, dropping them in disturbed soil along paths, or placing them at the edges of your fields. You do this again and again, year after year, generation after generation. You don't think of it as forestry, it's just common sense. Multiply that behaviour by thousands of people, spread across centuries, all noticing and favouring the same handful of especially valuable species. Slowly, the composition of the forest around human communities shifts. Edible, medicinal, fibre and oil-producing trees become unusually abundant. Less useful species become relatively rarer, at least in the zones people move through most. This is the core of the garden Amazon idea. Not endless fields in the European sense, not rectangular farms running to the horizon, but vast mosaics of semi-wild, semi-domesticated landscape. A forest still recognisably a forest, yet carrying a heavy human imprint in what grows where. Some of the clearest evidence comes from particular trees and palms. Brazil nut, for example. Today, huge Brazil nut trees tower above much of the western and central Amazon, forming a crucial part of the modern nut trade. They do not sprout easily on their own in closed canopy forest. They favour gaps, disturbed patches, old clearings. Studies of their distribution suggest that many of the densest stands occur near past and present human habitation. Their pattern looks less like a random scattering and more like the legacy of centuries of protection and encouragement. Acai palms tell a similar story. If you know acai as a smoothie ingredient, it may be strange to picture it as the backbone of entire local food systems. In many floodplain and upland regions, dense groves of acai provide fruit, palm hearts, and materials. Again, where people have lived for long periods, acai tends to be unusually common. People weed around the seedlings, thin competing vegetation, sometimes transplant suckers to more convenient spots. Left alone, acai forms clusters. Nudged along by human hands, those clusters become great bands and patches. Then there is peach palm. Unlike Brazil nut, peach palm bears clearer signs of domestication. Its fruits in managed groves are larger and more varied in colour than wild forms. The spines on cultivated varieties are often reduced, making harvesting easier. Archaeological evidence, charcoal, pollen, remains of palm wood, suggests that peach palm was a major staple in some pre-Columbian societies, providing both food and durable wood for construction and tools. When researchers map where peach palm is most common today, the pattern overlaps strikingly with regions that show dense pre-contact occupation. Earthworks, terra preta, ceramic-rich sites. It looks less like nature's doing, more like a remembered inheritance. And it wasn't just these few. Cacao, used for chocolate. Cupuaçu, with its fragrant pulp. Buriti palms, whose fruit, fibre and oil can supply food, roofs, mats, even cosmetics. Rubber trees, medicinal shrubs, vines whose fibres can be twisted into rope, plants whose leaves staunch bleeding, cure fevers, soothe stomachs. Together they formed a living infrastructure, a kind of biological toolkit woven into the forest itself. Managing this toolkit did not always mean cutting things down. Much of it was about selective attention. A woman gathering firewood might choose to leave a young fruit tree untouched, even if its wood would burn well. A man clearing a swidden field could leave standing certain palms, knowing their shade and fruit would benefit next year's crops. Children, taught which seedlings to recognize, might transplant them to better spots near home. Fire was part of this art. Small controlled burns, used to clear garden plots or renew pastures, also created patches of open, nutrient-rich soil that favoured light-loving species. Into those patches, desired plants could be encouraged to colonise, either naturally or by deliberate planting. In some regions, people seem to have created forest islands, in more open or seasonally dry landscapes, clusters of trees centred on ancient habitation mounds or old trash heaps. As organic waste decomposed and soil fertility increased, people planted or favoured useful species. Over time, these islands became distinct from the surrounding matrix, little archipelagos of abundance in what might otherwise have been poorer, sparser vegetation. When you walk through such a landscape centuries later, after the people have gone, the engineering is hard to see. There are no straight canals, no stone terraces. The trees have grown up, fallen, regrown. Vines have woven over old clearings. Fallen houses have turned back into soil. What remains is a statistical pattern, a higher than expected density of certain useful plants, a clustering of domesticated or semi-domesticated varieties around patches of dark, human-made earth. Subtle shifts in forest composition radiating outward from places where people once cooked, slept, fished, and buried their dead. From the ground, this can feel like coincidence. Looked at from the perspective of a satellite or a botanist's dataset, it starts to look intentional, and all of it was tied to daily life. Food, certainly, fruits, nuts, palm starches, oils, but also fibre for hammocks and fishing lines, wood for houseposts, canoes, bows and paddles, leaves for thatch, resins for glue and waterproofing, bark for dyes, medicines for infections, parasites, headaches, childbirth, even hallucinogens and stimulants used in ritual life. When your supermarket, pharmacy, hardware store and building supply warehouse are all, essentially, the forest, it makes sense to tend that forest with care. The result is a landscape that does not look domesticated in the way a European wheat field does, yet functions from a human perspective as a vast, multi-layered garden. Pause for a moment inside it. You're walking along a barely marked path, following someone who knows every bend. Underfoot, the soil is darker than in untouched forest, flecked with tiny bits of charcoal from fires long gone cold. Overhead, the canopy breaks just enough to let in dappled light. Your guide points, without slowing. That palm with the tight cluster of orange fruit, good for oil and animal bait. That towering tree with buttressed roots. Brazil nut. Don't stand under it when the pods fall. A shrub with inconspicuous leaves. Chew the bark for toothache. Another tree, its trunk slashed with diagonal scars from past resin collection. To you, it might all blur into green. To them, it is as legible as a well-stocked storeroom. This is why some researchers talk about the pre-contact Amazon as a domesticated forest, or cultural parkland. Not because every square kilometre was intensively managed in the same way, but because human choices about plants, what to favour, what to ignore, what to carry along a journey and plant in a new village, have left long-lasting signatures, and those signatures stretch far. In some studies, the zones of enriched useful species extend many kilometres away from the obvious centres of habitation. Trails, hunting grounds, temporary camps, and seasonal gardens all became, over time, corridors of plant management. People walking between river and upland, between dry season and wet season homes, were also walking seeds, cuttings, and preferences through the forest. From above, with modern tools, hints of this appear as shifting mosaics of species, patches of palm-rich forest where soil and hydrology alone don't explain their abundance. Lines of fruiting trees tracing old, forgotten paths. From within the forest, you mostly feel it in what is possible. The fact that you rarely have to travel far to find something useful. The way scarcity is mitigated by prior generations' quiet, cumulative work. This is part of why the idea of an untouched Amazon doesn't fit very well with the evidence. By the time Europeans arrived, much of the basin had already been living with, and within, a human-influenced forest for millennia. When disease and disruption came, and populations plummeted, that influence didn't vanish overnight. Trees grow on a slower clock than empires. The orchards kept standing, even when many of their gardeners were gone. And those gardeners were not living in isolated homesteads, each surrounded by its own tiny patch. They were tied into larger webs, of paths, of rivers, of exchange. The managed forest was one layer in a broader pattern of low-density yet highly connected human settlement. To see that wider pattern, you have to zoom out again, from a single palm grove to whole regions, from one village's forest to chains of communities strung along rivers and ridges, sharing plants, knowledge, and people over long distances. When researchers try to imagine how many people once moved through these networks, the numbers get large. They start from things that do leave traces: the size and spacing of earthworks, the volume of terra preta, the density of pottery fragments in certain regions, the capacity of raised fields to support crops, early European reports of crowded rivers. Different scholars arrive at different estimates, and there is no single, agreed-on total. Some argue for a few million across the whole basin, on the eve of European contact. Others, looking at especially dense regions like parts of the central and southwestern Amazon, suggest that 10 million, or even more, might not be unreasonable at the peak. These are not census counts. They are reconstructions, built up from patches of data and a lot of careful modelling. How many people can a hectare of fertile floodplain support, given the crops and techniques we think were used? How large a labour force would be needed to dig thousands of kilometres of ditches or maintain vast raised field complexes? How many villages does it take to justify the amount of broken pottery spread across a landscape? You can feel the uncertainty in all of this, but the trend points in a clear direction. Whatever the exact figure, the Amazon before 1492 was probably not sparsely sprinkled with a few small bands of foragers. It seems to have supported large interconnected populations, living in ways that do not map neatly onto our usual images of city and country. This is where the idea of low-density urbanism comes in. If you're used to thinking of urban life as stone walls, crowded streets and towering monuments, it is hard to see anything urban in a forest full of wooden houses and palm-thatched roofs. But in many parts of the world, ancient Southeast Asia, parts of Africa, even some regions of pre-Columbian North America, people built what you might call spread-out cities. Instead of one tight core, you had clusters of homes, gardens, orchards, shrines, and small plazas, sometimes stretching for tens of kilometres, linked by paths and canals. Population could be quite high, but the built environment was interlaced with fields, groves, and patches of forest. Density, not in vertical stone, but in people and their activities. Something like this seems to have existed in portions of the Amazon. Along certain rivers, archaeologists find long chains of sites, spaced at regular intervals, each with mounds, plazas, or ditches. On some interfluvial plateaus, LiDAR reveals repeating patterns: circular or rectangular earthworks, causeways, raised fields, and house platforms forming loose clusters and alignments. Imagine walking through such a landscape at its height. You leave one village, houses on stilts, hammocks strung under broad eaves, manioc grating platforms shaded by fruit trees. After an hour on a forest path, you emerge into another cluster. More houses, more gardens, maybe a small plaza with a dance ground kept carefully clear. Continue on, and every few kilometres there is another node. Not continuous buildings, but continuous human presence. Low density, high connectivity. Rivers amplified this effect. Waterways in the Amazon are not just features of the landscape, they are the main roads. A dugout canoe paddled by practiced hands is faster and easier than walking through forest, especially when loaded with goods. So villages strung along a major river, in some accounts, one after another, endless, functioned much like linear towns. People 100 kilometres apart could be in regular contact, exchanging news, marriage partners, and goods. Those goods tell their own story. Across the basin, archaeologists find ceramics, whose styles cluster in particular regions, but also show up far from their apparent centres. Finer wares and distinctive painted vessels may have travelled as prestige items, traded or gifted along networks of alliance and ritual. Stone, too, moved. Much of the central Amazon is poor in high-quality stone suitable for tools, yet at sites there you find blades, axes, and ground stone objects made from rock that outcrops only hundreds of kilometres away. Somewhere, people were quarrying, shaping, and sending these materials along rivers and paths. Feathers from brightly coloured birds might move in the opposite direction, from forest-rich interior zones toward more open or seasonally dry fringes. Salt, scarce in some parts of the lowlands, likely flowed along trade routes from natural salt licks or evaporated sources. Shells from the mouth of the Amazon or from distant coasts appear far inland, suggesting long chains of exchange. There were also ritual and symbolic items, stone or bone ornaments with distinctive forms, beads, carved amulets, specialized pipes or snuff trays used for hallucinogenic powders. Some motifs recur over vast areas, as if particular styles or cults had spread through multiple societies. Others remain highly localized, hints of small-scale traditions nested inside larger spheres of interaction. And of course, food moved. Certain varieties of manioc, maize, beans, peppers, and fruits were likely spread not just by individual families, but along broader social routes, traded, gifted, or carried by people relocating between communities. A better-yielding manioc strain in one region could, over generations, radiate outward along kinship lines, slowly reshaping food systems far from its origin. These flows of goods imply a corresponding flow of relationships. What did social organization look like in such a world? Probably it varied enormously from place to place. Along some rivers, early European observers described clear hierarchies, powerful chiefs, multi-village polities, regional leaders coordinating labour and war. In other areas, authority seems to have been more dispersed, with autonomous villages linked by kinship and ritual, rather than commanded by a single ruler. Archaeology hints at multiple scales. There are small sites, likely single villages or hamlets. There are larger complexes with central plazas and more substantial earthworks, which might have served as ceremonial and political hubs. In some regions, repeated patterns of similarly sized sites arranged around a slightly larger centre suggest something like a regional confederation, several communities tied together under shared leadership and ritual. These centres may not have been occupied year-round by large populations. Instead, people could gather there seasonally for feasts, markets and ceremonies, then disperse back to smaller settlements. Power in such systems might be expressed less through permanent stone monuments and more through the ability to convene bodies, human bodies, for work, ritual and exchange. Languages layered over this political complexity. The Amazon today is a mosaic of language families and isolates, and linguistic work suggests something similar, or even more diverse in the past. Borders between language groups may have been fuzzy, with wide multilingual frontiers where people learn to switch tongues as easily as we switch registers. Trade partners, in-laws, ritual specialists, and travelling healers would carry not only goods, but stories and words across these boundaries. In such a landscape, being able to speak multiple languages, or at least understand trade pidgins and ritual phrases, was probably a key form of competence. All of this raises another question. How did people coordinate large projects, ditches, raised fields, fortified enclosures, without the kind of densely packed stone cities we often associate with big labour forces? Part of the answer lies in the materials themselves. Earth, wood, and fibre are abundant and relatively easy to work when many hands turn up, especially at the right times of year. A ditch several kilometres long, or a ring of defensive earthworks, may look monumental from the air, but if dozens of households come together for a few weeks every dry season, digging with wooden and stone tools, moving soil in baskets, the work becomes manageable. Seasonal rhythms provided natural windows for such cooperation. During flood times, when fields were underwater or in the slack between planting and harvest, people could devote energy to communal projects, renewing raised fields, digging canals and fish weirs, repairing palisades, expanding plazas, building or rethatching large communal houses used for ceremony and politics. Labour was probably not extracted in the same way as in a regimented, bureaucratic state. It may have been organised through kinship obligations, ritual obligations, and the promise of shared feasts. Chiefs and ritual leaders could mobilise followers not only by command but by persuasion, prestige, and spiritual authority. From the historian's perspective, however, almost everything that made this system work was fragile in physical terms. Wooden posts rot, thatch collapses, packed earth erodes, trails disappear under leaf litter. Even large communal houses built on low mounds can, given a few centuries of abandonment and tree growth, lose their sharp outlines. Plazas infill with soil and leaf fall, ditches clog and turn into subtle depressions. In humid tropical conditions, even bones and textiles vanish quickly. The forest is an efficient recycler. When populations crashed after European contact, and many of these low-density urban landscapes were abandoned or drastically thinned out, the living structures that had made them visible from within, cleared spaces, maintained paths, frequently used waterways, began to fade. Trees reclaimed house sites, orchards blurred back into general forest. Raised fields and causeways, once kept sharply defined by constant use and upkeep, softened under new vegetation. From above, seen centuries later by satellite or lidar, the ghosts of these arrangements become visible again as faint lines and shapes. On the ground, walking through thick undergrowth, they are much harder to perceive. This is the interpretive challenge. A region that might once have held tens or hundreds of thousands of people in a web of dispersed settlements, gardens and ritual centres can, a few hundred years after abandonment, look like continuous forest with only scattered hints of human presence. A shard of pottery washed out by a stream, a strangely regular mound under the roots of a giant tree, an unusually abundant stand of fruit-bearing palms. To reconstruct how 10 million people, if that is indeed close to the truth, might have lived here, we are piecing together patterns from things that are biased toward survival. Earth, stone, durable potsherds, long-lived trees. What we do not see directly are the perishable parts, the woven hammocks, the painted wooden posts, the barkcloth banners, the canoes moored along every bend of a once busy river, the sounds of multiple languages echoing across a plaza, the smell of roasting fish and fermenting manioc beer at a seasonal gathering. Those absences make it tempting to imagine emptiness. But when you line up the surviving clues, the density of earthworks, the spread of terra preta, the distributions of useful trees, the traces of trade goods, the ethnographic parallels, and the earliest, astonished European descriptions, a different picture starts to emerge, a forest woven through with people, their gardens and their networks stretching farther than any one village or valley, and it is in the voices of those first outsiders, arriving at the very end of this long story, that we catch a brief flickering glimpse of that world still intact, just before it began to unravel. When Europeans first pushed their way into this river world, they did not arrive with LiDAR or pollen cores or radiocarbon dating. They arrived in boats, with steel and gunpowder, and their own expectations of what civilization should look like, and almost at once they started writing. Those writings are some of the only direct descriptions we have of the Amazonian world before it was shattered. They are also some of the most frustrating sources in all of historical research, vivid, contradictory, often self-serving, filtered through multiple languages and layers of misunderstanding. But if we read them carefully, if we set aside for a moment the temptation to dismiss them as fantasy, they start to line up in surprising ways with what archaeology and ecology are now revealing. One of the most famous of these journeys begins in disaster. In 1541, a Spanish expedition under Gonzalo Pizarro set out from Quito in the Andes, looking for cinnamon groves, gold, and a rumoured rich province somewhere to the east. The men were poorly supplied, badly informed, and not particularly well suited for the lowlands they were about to enter. Starvation and disease began almost immediately. To try to find food, Pizarro sent a smaller party downriver in a brigantine, essentially a small light sailing vessel, under the command of Francisco de Orellana. The idea was simple: float downstream, gather supplies, and come back. The river had other plans. The current was stronger than expected. The banks closed in. Turning back became impossible. Orellana and his companions were carried, unwillingly at first, into the heart of the basin. Over the following months they drifted and rowed along what would later be called the Amazon, making contact with one riverine society after another. When they finally emerged on the Atlantic coast in 1542, they had, according to their own account, traversed thousands of kilometres through an inhabited landscape. Their story, later written up by the Dominican friar Gaspar de Carvajal, is full of hunger, fear, and religious interpretation. But it is also full of careful observation. Carvajal describes long stretches of riverbank lined with settlements, not scattered huts separated by miles of forest, but very large villages and great towns appearing one after another. He notes plazas, communal houses, cultivated fields and storehouses. He mentions canoes coming out in numbers to trade or to fight. He talks about organised resistance, warriors with shields and bows, massing along the banks under leaders who could coordinate attacks over distance. In one famous passage, he describes a battle in which the Spanish are attacked by a force that appears to include women fighting alongside men. Some, he says, are leaders. They shoot arrows with deadly accuracy, and the Spaniards are shocked enough to give them a familiar name from their own mythology: Amazons. It is from this moment, this startled comparison, that the whole river, and eventually the entire basin, would take its European name. For a long time, historians treated Carvajal's account with deep suspicion. Partly, this was because it sounded too much like a travel romance. The Amazons looked suspiciously like a classical reference, borrowed from Greek and Roman tales of warrior women. The descriptions of great towns and continuous settlement clashed with the later experience of missionaries and colonists, who often found only small, scattered villages along the same routes. It was easy to assume that Carvajal had exaggerated to enhance the glory of the expedition, or simply misperceived what he saw in conditions of stress and fear. European intellectuals in the 19th and early 20th centuries also brought their own assumptions. They tended to see tropical forests as hostile to complex society. The soil, by their lights, was too poor, the climate too wet, the diseases too numerous. Large, dense populations in such a place did not fit their models. So the pendulum swung towards scepticism. Orellana's journey was not dismissed entirely, but its more dramatic claims were often downplayed. Maybe the Spaniards had mistaken seasonal gathering places for permanent towns. Maybe they had seen the same communities multiple times along different channels and thought them distinct. Maybe Carvajal, writing years later, simply made things larger and more continuous in memory. The story of warrior women, in particular, was relegated to the realm of legend, a European projection onto a landscape they did not yet understand, and yet, piece by piece, other evidence began to accumulate. Archaeologists working in the central and lower Amazon started finding large mounds and earthworks in regions Carvajal described as populated. In some stretches, dense terra preta soils and artifact scatters line the river margins, suggesting long-term, intensive settlement zones very much like those his narrative implies. Elsewhere, in the Upper Madeira and in parts of today's Acre and Rondonia, geoglyphs, road-like ditches, and clustered sites reveal regional systems of settlement and labour coordination that could easily have fed into the kind of endless villages impression a traveller might get from the water. Radiocarbon dates from many of these features fall into the late pre-contact centuries, exactly the period just before or overlapping with Orellana's passage. Meanwhile, ecological studies show belts of domesticated and semi-domesticated trees lining old river courses, forming orchard forests that would have required long-term management by substantial nearby populations. Historical linguistics suggests that, in some regions, language families with wide distributions in the early colonial period must have expanded through quite populous networks. None of this proves that every detail of Carvajal's account is accurate. What it does suggest is that his fundamental impression, that of a heavily inhabited river corridor with organised polities, cultivated fields, and the capacity for coordinated warfare, was not as implausible as later scholars thought. But we still have to move carefully. European chroniclers were outsiders with their own cultural templates. They looked for kings and found caciques, a term borrowed from the Caribbean and applied widely to very different kinds of leaders. They expected fortresses and city walls. Instead, they saw palisades, ditches, and the social strength of alliances. They were frightened by massed canoes and disciplined volley fire. They reached for the language of armies and battles drawn from European warfare. Even the simple act of counting could mislead. A flotilla of dozens of canoes, each with several people in it, could be described as hundreds or thousands of warriors, especially by men under attack. Riverbank settlements, visible from the water only in cleared windows through the vegetation, might be perceived as continuous where they were actually separated by short stretches of managed forest and orchards. Or, conversely, a sophisticated web of small hamlets and gardens could be dismissed as nothing but a few huts, if it did not conform to the observer's idea of a town. Translation added another layer. Words for social roles, kinship categories, or ritual offices had to pass through interpreters, often from different language groups, then into Spanish or Portuguese, then sometimes into Latin or other European tongues. Nuances were flattened. A leader whose authority was seasonal or contingent on ritual performance might be rendered simply as chief. A confederation of villages with intricate mutual obligations could be described as belonging to a single nation, as if it were a centralized state. The legend of the Amazons shows this process at work. Women in Amazonian societies have long played crucial roles in agriculture, ritual, and sometimes in conflict. Ethnographic accounts from much later periods describe women taking part in defensive actions, or wielding clubs and bows alongside men when communities were attacked. Stratified gender concepts from Iberia, where proper women were imagined as secluded and non-combative, made such scenes seem extraordinary. So when Carvajal saw or heard about women fighting, he reached for the closest analogy he knew: warrior women from the classical tradition. The name stuck. Over time, stories of a separate female-only tribe, or of a distant queen ruling over a hidden nation of women, accreted around the original more ambiguous observations. From a modern perspective, the Amazons of the Amazon are best understood not as a settled historical fact, nor as pure fantasy, but as a cultural artifact, an intersection between indigenous realities and European storytelling habits. There may well have been communities where women fought, or where certain ritual or political roles gave women unusual prominence. The way those facts were filtered and retold tells us as much about European minds as it does about local societies. Behind all these distortions lie voices that are harder to hear. Indigenous perspectives on these first contacts survive only in fragments. Oral traditions recorded centuries later, myths that seem to encode memories of strangers arriving from the river mouth or from the Andes. Accounts told to anthropologists in the 20th century of plagues and slave raids that swept ancestors away. Many groups were entirely wiped out before anyone wrote down their stories. Others saw their populations collapse so rapidly that social memory itself was shaken. Ritual specialists died, lineages ended, sacred objects were lost or deliberately destroyed to avoid capture. Languages vanished, taking with them idioms, genealogies, and place-based knowledge. Where indigenous voices do surface in the early records, they are often mediated by missionary pens or wrapped in the logic of confession and conversion. We catch glimpses: anger at slave raids, confusion at European disease, strategic attempts to ally with one set of outsiders against another. We see leaders trying to integrate these newcomers into existing diplomatic and ritual frameworks, sometimes with astonishing adaptability. But the texture of their inner understanding, the ways they made sense of the forests, rivers, and settlements that were their world, is mostly beyond our reach. This is one of the quiet tragedies of the story. When Orellana floated through his maze of riverine polities, he was not entering a frontier. He was entering a climax state, a landscape shaped by thousands of years of human work, occupied by people who had mastered its rhythms, contested its boundaries, and woven it into dense tapestries of meaning. From our vantage point, those first European accounts mark a beginning, the start of known history in the Amazon, because they left written records that fit comfortably on our bookshelves. For the people living there, contact was not a beginning. It was the start of an ending. Not because their systems were weak or primitive or somehow destined to fail, but because they were about to be hit by forces for which no society on Earth had any true preparation. Waves of new diseases, armed slaving expeditions, cascading demographic collapse. In the next part of this story, the tone of the sources shifts. Descriptions of populous banks and organized polities give way, within a few generations, to reports of empty villages, deserted rivers, and wasted lands. To understand how a forest that remembered so much could seem, in such a short time, to have forgotten the people who built it, we have to follow that descent, through epidemic, violence, and abandonment, into the long silence that came after. When we say, after 1492, it can sound like a single moment. A door opening, a ship arriving, a flag planted. In reality, what followed was less like a dramatic invasion, and more like a long, uneven shockwave pulsing through the basin. It did not hit everywhere at once. It did not look the same on every river. It moved along the same networks that had once carried pottery styles, stories, and marriage partners. Now they carried something else. The first were the diseases: smallpox, measles, influenza, perhaps typhus. Maybe even unknown viral strains that flared and then vanished with the people they burned through. These pathogens had evolved for centuries in the dense interconnected populations of Afro-Eurasia. Cities, caravan routes, and shipping lanes had given them endless opportunities to refine their strategies. The peoples of the Amazon had never met them. To a society with no prior exposure, these microbes were not just bad flus. They were civilization-level events, and they did not need soldiers or missionaries to travel. They needed only contact. Imagine how that might have worked. Somewhere on the Caribbean coast, or along the lower Orinoco, a native trading party meets Europeans, or other indigenous groups already in contact with them. Gifts are exchanged, food is shared. There is curiosity, caution, perhaps a few days of feasting. Someone coughs. A week later, a young trader feels tired as he joins his companions in their canoe and begins the long paddle upriver. The network takes over from there. The Amazonian world was not a scatter of isolated bands. It was a web. Downstream groups knew upstream groups. Portage routes linked one basin to another. Trade fairs and ritual gatherings pulled people together at specific seasons. Salt, feathers, stone tools, ceramics, ritual items, and news moved through this web all the time. So did germs. You do not need direct contact between Europeans and every village for an epidemic to spread. You need one infected person to arrive at a regional centre, or even just to pass through, exchanging goods, resting for a night in a communal house filled with hammocks. By the time the first strangers in iron helmets appear in a given stretch of river, the disease front may already have passed through once, twice, 3 times. This helps explain one of the puzzles of the historical record. Carvajal in the early 1540s describes thickly settled banks and organised opposition. A century later, along some of the same routes, Missionaries and colonists report stretches of empty river, occasional small villages, and widespread talk among survivors of past plagues. It is unlikely that these later observers simply missed millions of people. It is also unlikely that the entire transformation happened instantly, at one date we could circle on a calendar. More probably, the basin experienced waves of disease moving at different speeds along different lines of connection. Some areas, tightly bound into continental trade, may have been struck early, even before sustained local European presence. Others, further from those arteries, might have remained relatively intact into the 17th century. In some places, the first epidemic killed half, or 2/3, or more of a community. Those who survived had no time to rest. Crises compounded. Because disease was not the only force reshaping the Amazonian world. From the very beginning of European occupation on the Atlantic coast and in the Andean foothills, there was demand for labour. Sugar mills, cattle ranches, mines, and colonial towns all needed workers. Coastal and highland indigenous populations, having been devastated themselves, could not meet that demand, so raiding parties pushed inland, up the rivers. The Portuguese called it the bandeira system in some regions, mixed expeditions of colonists, mission Indians and freebooters, moving in canoes, capturing people. Others organised more informally as slaving raids from frontier outposts. Even where we lack detailed records, indigenous oral histories and scattered documents agree, strangers came up the rivers and took captives. Sometimes they came under the banner of just war, claiming that targeted groups were cannibals or rebels. Sometimes they came as nominal allies, demanding tribute in bodies. Sometimes they came simply as pirates, their motives obvious. Missionization added another layer. Jesuits, Franciscans, Carmelites, and other orders established missions along the main channels and tributaries. Their stated aim was spiritual, to gather people, instruct them, and create new Christian communities. To do that, they often encouraged or compelled people from scattered villages and from different ethnic and linguistic groups to relocate around the mission. This had double effects. On one hand, missions could sometimes offer relative protection against the worst excesses of colonial settlers, acting as buffers. On the other hand, concentration made disease more lethal. A pathogen entering a mission settlement found dense housing, shared spaces, and frequent contact. Epidemics that might have burned out in smaller, more dispersed communities now swept through large congregated populations. Forced relocations were not limited to missions. Colonial authorities and private entrepreneurs sometimes moved entire groups to work on ranches, to build forts, or to repopulate areas near colonial towns. Refugees fleeing slave raids on one river might seek shelter with kin on another, inadvertently carrying disease with them. Victims of epidemic might abandon a village and move closer to a colonial outpost in search of trade goods or perceived safety. Every movement, every gathering, every new cluster of hammocks under a single roof increased the opportunities for microbes to find new hosts. Under these conditions, warfare changed. Pre-contact conflict in the Amazon was real and often intense, but it followed its own logics, bound by ritual, politics, and ecological constraints. After sustained European arrival, new weapons and new pressures altered the calculus. Iron tools and firearms became prizes. Alliances with colonial powers could be used to settle old scores with neighbouring groups. Slave raiding and defensive responses to it set off spirals of violence. None of this happened evenly. In some regions, missions and colonial towns remained tiny islands along vast forested margins, their influence limited. In others, particularly along parts of the lower Amazon and certain Andean-facing tributaries, the combination of slaving, missionization, and epidemic seems to have been brutal and rapid. What did this mean on the ground, in the forest? Think back to the raised fields, the orchards, the earthworks, and the dark, rich soils of Terra Preta. All of these required people, not necessarily in Stone City numbers, but in sustained, coordinated effort. Canals had to be cleared, mounds had to be maintained, orchards had to be pruned, weeds cut back, undergrowth managed with fire. Fish weirs had to be repaired, planting schedules had to be remembered and followed. Remove half the population in a decade, and things begin to fray. Remove 3/4, 4/5 over a few generations, and whole systems snap. Fields are left unburned one season, then two, a canal clogs. A raised field floods and erodes. A village with a long tradition of making black earth loses its elders to sickness. Their precise recipes and rhythms go unrecorded. Young survivors marry across groups in mission towns, speaking new languages, learning new skills, struggling simply to live. The forest responds quickly. In the tropics, abandonment is not a slow fading, it is a rush. Vines creep over fallows, seedlings sprout between collapsed houseposts. Former manioc fields turn first to thickets, then to young forest, then, over decades, to what looks, at a glance, like primary jungle. Along riverbanks, stretches that once held clusters of houses and gardens become curtains of trees again. Sites that had been cleared and farmed for centuries can, in the space of a human lifetime, look as if no one ever lived there. This is part of why later travellers, moving along some of the same channels as Orellana, saw so little of what he had seen. They were not looking at an unchanged wilderness. They were looking at the late stages of a demographic collapse, with the forest doing what it does best: reclaiming. How total was that collapse? Here we enter a zone of inference and regional variation. For some macro regions, such as parts of the lower Amazon, scholars have suggested population losses of 80 to 90% or more over the first 2 centuries after contact. For others, especially remote interfluvial zones, the initial impact may have been much more delayed and diffuse. Some societies appear to have maintained relative continuity well into the colonial period, adapting to new conditions without complete breakdown. There were refuges. Groups fled deeper into uplands, into blackwater tributaries, into less accessible headwater regions. Some mission communities, despite all their constraints, became places where certain practices and stories persisted in new forms. Not every earthwork was abandoned, not every orchard went untended. Even where language shift occurred, memories often held. Place names are one clue. Rivers, hills, and old village sites across Amazonia still carry indigenous names that refer to things no longer visible: Field Place, Old House Bank, Fishweir Portage. Oral traditions, when recorded in the 20th century among groups who had endured these centuries of catastrophe, sometimes speak of the time of the Great Sickness, or of ancestors driven from rich lands closer to the main rivers by people who came with thunder or with iron. Certain agricultural and forest management practices also survived in fragments. Knowledge of particular tree species, fire use, and soil care often persisted even after the larger systems that once organized them had dissolved. A family planting Brazil nuts around a new homestead, or carefully maintaining a grove of peach palms, may be unconsciously echoing much older landscape designs. From the outside, looking back through fragmented records, it is easy to see only disappearance: empty banks, geoglyphs hidden under canopy, populations reduced to a fraction of their former size. From the inside, for the descendants of those who survived, the story includes something else: continuity amid rupture. Stories told in new languages about old places, rituals adapted to new calendars but still tied, in quiet ways, to rivers and clearings that no longer exist. The very idea, held by many contemporary Amazonian peoples, that certain forest patches are old villages or places of the elders, suggests an enduring sense that the forest is not blank space, but layered memory. So when we talk about vanishing, we have to be careful. The large-scale systems that once supported perhaps 10 million people across the basin did, in many regions, collapse. Landscapes that had been intensively managed were abandoned or drastically simplified. Political networks shattered, entire languages and lineages were lost. But peoples did not disappear like mist. They were killed, captured, moved, mixed, converted and transformed. Some are still there, living descendants of the builders of terra preta fields and forest cities, even if the ancestral towns themselves are now hidden beneath the trees. The apparent emptiness that later Europeans claimed to see was not the original state of the Amazon. It was the aftermath of a catastrophe. In the next part of this story, we will listen to the forest itself, to the soil, the tree communities, and the faint outlines of earthworks beneath the canopy, to see how, even in abandonment, the land remembered what had been done to it, and slowly, quietly, hid the evidence from human eyes. To understand how the Amazon could hold cities and then seem to erase them, you have to think on rainforest time, not centuries, seasons. Start with a single house. Its posts are wood, its roof is thatch, Its walls are woven from palm and vine plastered with clay. The plaza around it is swept clear every day, beaten flat by bare feet, smoke and sun. Paths connect it to other houses, to gardens, to the river. Now imagine that house abandoned. Maybe everyone left at once, fleeing raiders or an epidemic. Maybe the last old woman died, and the survivors decided to move closer to allies downstream. However it happens, the brooms are put away. The last fire goes out, the clay floor cracks. The forest does not wait politely. Termites and beetles move into the posts. Fungi spread filaments through the thatch. Insects lay eggs in every damp crevice. The next heavy rain soaks the roof. A corner sags. Within a year or two, the walls lean and collapse. The beams rot. The thatch dissolves into a dark matted layer. Wind brings seeds. Bats drop fruit pits as they roost on the remaining posts. Birds perch, defecate, and leave behind more seeds still wrapped in a small packet of fertilizer. Some land in the rich, disturbed soil of the old plaza and germinate. In temperate climates, abandonment can mean slow decay. Barns standing for generations, foundations marking fields long after they are farmed. In a humid tropical forest, the half-life of exposed wood and earth is shockingly short. A wooden house can be gone in a decade. A palisade in 20 years, even an earth wall, if cut by heavy rains and no longer stabilized by human maintenance, can slump and blur within a human lifetime. Scale that up. Raised fields built over generations can begin to erode as soon as the canals that drained them clog with silt and leaf litter. Roads paved with packed earth, or lined with logs, lose their definition as roots heave them, and water cuts new channels across their surface. Fish weirs collapse. Ditches soften. Clearings close. At first, the regrowth is obvious. High grass, shrubs, pioneer trees, sun-loving species that rush into any open space. To someone who knew the old layout, who grew up running along the embankments and tending the gardens, the pattern would still be clear, but then 10 years pass, then 20, then 50. Fast-growing trees, some reaching 20 or 30 meters within a few decades, throw a canopy over the old village site. Understory plants fill in. Epiphytes climb the new trunks. The sharp line between field and forest that once required constant work to maintain fuzzes out and vanishes. Look at it now from a canoe, drifting along the river. What you see is an unbroken wall of green. Trunks, lianas, broad leaves. The same at a glance as the stretches that were never cleared at all. This is one of the central tricks the Amazon plays on human memory. Regrowth can mimic primeval forests so effectively that a place intensely managed for centuries ends up looking, to an outsider, like a place that has always been wild. Under that canopy, though, the ghost of the city is still there. Roads survive as slightly raised, slightly straighter lines under the leaf litter. Ditches hold a little more moisture than the surrounding ground. Different plants favour that microhabitat. Plaza edges, once sharply defined by houses, become subtle platforms. To bare eyes at ground level, in dim green light, they are easy to miss, just natural undulations in the forest floor. To see the pattern, you often need distance, or tools. But before those tools, long before LiDAR and satellite imagery, the forest itself kept certain memories in another way, through its species. When people manage landscapes for centuries, they do not just move soil and water, they move genes. They plant, select, protect and transport useful trees and crops. Even when the gardens are abandoned, many of those species do not simply vanish. They persist as what some researchers call botanical ghost signatures. You can walk through what appears to be undisturbed forest and notice, if you're trained to see it, that the composition of trees is odd. There are too many Brazil nut trees for a random patch, or too many peach palms or cacao trees, or certain fruit-bearing species that do not usually cluster so tightly on their own. Studies in different parts of Amazonia have shown that around present and ancient settlements, the forest is statistically enriched in domesticated or semi-domesticated species. Groves of useful trees might mark where households once stood. Lines of certain palms may trace an old path or canal bank. Even centuries after a community collapses and new trees have grown up, the ratio is still skewed. The forest, in other words, is not neutral. It has been gardened, and it remembers that gardening and its species mix. This kind of ghost signature blurs the boundary between natural and cultural in a way that can be easy to overlook if you enter the story, assuming a wilderness untouched by humans. There is another, broader kind of ghost as well, one that has entered global climate debates. If, as some estimates suggest, millions of people across the basin died or were displaced after 1492, and vast areas of managed forest, field and riverine infrastructure were abandoned, what did that mean for carbon? Fields left to regrow sequester carbon quickly in fast-growing biomass. Secondary forests pull CO2 out of the atmosphere as they rebuild trunks, branches and roots. Some researchers have proposed that the post-contact collapse of indigenous populations in the Americas contributed to a measurable drawdown of atmospheric carbon in the following centuries. This idea is sometimes linked to a slight dip in global temperatures seen in climate records, the so-called Little Ice Age. The hypothesis goes, fewer people farming and burning, more forestry growth, more carbon stored in biomass and soils, a small but real effect on climate. Not everyone agrees on the magnitude of this effect. Estimates of pre-contact populations vary. So do models of how quickly forests regrow and how much area was actually under active cultivation versus low-impact management. But the underlying point is striking. The disappearance of Amazonian societies may not only have reshaped the local landscape, it may have left a faint fingerprint in the chemistry of the entire atmosphere. How then do we trace these lost worlds today, when so much of their material fabric has dissolved? Archaeologists turn to the scraps that tropical decay cannot easily erase. Charcoal, for instance. When people burn fields, cook food, make pottery, or manage forest with controlled fire, they produce charcoal. Some of that charcoal ends up buried in soil, especially in places like Terra Preta. It can persist for thousands of years. A dark, carbon-rich lens a metre below the surface might represent a former fireplace, a slash-and-burn event, or decades of hearth sweepings from a household. Pollen, too, accumulates in lakes, oxbow ponds, and wetlands. Year after year, plants shed their pollen into the air, some settles in water and becomes trapped in sediment. By taking cores of that sediment and examining the pollen grains under microscopes, researchers can reconstruct past vegetation. Changes in the relative abundance of forest pollen versus crops or disturbance-loving species can signal times when people were clearing or farming intensively, and times when fields were abandoned and forest returned. Then there are phytoliths, microscopic silica bodies formed inside plant tissues. Different plant families produce differently shaped phytoliths. These tiny glassy fragments can survive where pollen does not, embedding themselves in soils on former habitation sites, outlining what kinds of plants grew there long after the plants themselves have rotted. Add to this broken pottery, often the most durable artifact in tropical contexts. Sherds can be scattered thinly over a hilltop or buried in anthrosols. Their style, composition and distribution help map where people lived, cooked and stored food. And beneath the leaf litter, the land itself holds clues. A low ridge might be an old causeway. A shallow, straight depression could mark a canal. Circular embankments on a forested plateau may be the ghosts of earthwork enclosures. Sometimes they are so subtle that you can stand on them and feel nothing unusual. Only when someone draws a contour map or looks from above does the geometry leap out. Imagine walking through such a forest with a researcher who has spent years reading these clues. They stop on what feels like ordinary, gently sloping ground and say quietly, "We're on the edge of a plaza." You look around, trunks, vines, scattered shafts of light. Nothing that resembles a town square. Then they take out notebook or tablet and show you a map. Lines appear. The slope you're standing on is an almost perfect rectangle. Its sides are lined along a compass bearing. To one side, a parallel ridge marks an old street. In another direction, faint arcs represent house platforms. The straightness, the symmetry, the repetition, all the hallmarks of design, emerge when the raw bumps of the forest floor are translated into elevation lines. The map makes visible what your senses alone could not. This is the heart of the detective work. Each clue, charcoal, pollen, phytoliths, pottery, subtle topography, on its own might be ambiguous. Together, across many sites and regions, they reveal a pattern. A basin once full of engineered soils, earthworks, gardens, fish farms, and low-density urban networks, later wrapped in a cloak of regrown forest. The forest did not erase the evidence. It covered it, rearranged it, blended it with its own processes until, to hurried eyes, it looked like pure nature. For a long time, that was enough to convince many observers that nothing significant had ever been there. In the next part of this story, new ways of seeing, especially from the air, will begin to peel back that cloak, showing that the empty spaces are anything but, and that under the canopy, the memory of cities is written in the very shape of the land. Begin in a small plain, high above that same unbroken canopy. For a long time, this vantage point did not help much. From above, the forest is still a carpet of green. Ridges and valleys blur into a soft textured surface. Whatever faint embankments and ditches exist on the ground are hidden by 30 meters of leaves and branches. The revolution did not come from simply looking down. It came from learning how to look through. LiDAR, short for light detection and ranging, is, at its core, a way of measuring distance with light. A device fires hundreds of thousands of laser pulses every second toward the ground. Some of those pulses hit the canopy and bounce back. Others slip between leaves, strike branches, understory, or finally, the soil itself. By timing how long each pulse takes to return, the instrument builds a cloud of points in 3 dimensions: the top of the canopy, the understory, and crucially, the bare earth hidden underneath. Strip away the points that belong to vegetation, and what remains is a ghostly grayscale version of the land surface beneath the forest. In that bare earth model, patterns that are invisible from the ground suddenly leap into focus. Straight lines that no river or landslide would make. Perfect circles and rectangles perched on hilltops, grids of parallel embankments, long ruler-straight causeways running for kilometers across what appears, on satellite images, to be untouched forest. LiDAR is only one of the new tools, but symbolically it's powerful. It does in a digital instant what archaeologists have been trying to do for decades. Peel back the forest cloak without cutting it down. Other eyes help as well. High-resolution satellite imagery allows researchers to scan vast areas, looking for subtle changes in canopy color or texture that might hint at ancient fields or earthworks. Drones can fly low and slow over promising spots, capturing detailed photographs and small-scale LiDAR data that fill in the gaps. On the ground, soil chemistry offers another map. By sampling grids of soil and measuring their contents, phosphorus, calcium, charcoal, organic carbon, scientists can trace invisible footprints of past human activity. Terra Preta stands out as a dark, nutrient-rich anomaly. Even where no obvious mounds or ditches remain, a patch of unusually fertile soil in the middle of otherwise poor ground can signal long-term habitation, middens, or gardens. Then there is the quiet work of big data. Each new survey, each excavation, each soil core adds points to a growing spatial database. Locations of Terra Preta, coordinates of known earthworks, radiocarbon dates tied to specific layers and features. When these are plotted together in geographic information systems, patterns of settlement and land use begin to emerge at the scale of regions, even continents. What once seemed like scattered curiosities, an odd ditch here, a strange mound there, start to line up into networks. In some parts of Amazonia, the result has been astonishing. In southwestern Amazonia, especially in Acre, LiDAR and aerial surveys have revealed hundreds of geometric earthworks, ditches and embankments forming circles, squares, and complex polygons, some more than 300 meters across. Many were once thought to lie only in areas now cleared for pasture and fields. LiDAR has shown that equally elaborate structures continue under the remaining forest. Farther north, in regions of the Brazilian state of Amazonas and into Bolivia, raised fields, causeways, and fish weirs form intricate mosaics. In the upper Xingu, a cluster of pre-contact settlements connected by roads and canals, surrounded by managed forests and fields, has been interpreted as a kind of low-density urban system. Not one big city, but many medium-sized centres, integrated into a regional network. In central and eastern Amazonia, patterns of Terra Preta along rivers suggest strings of closely spaced villages, each surrounded by orchards and gardens, forming continuous or semi-continuous belts of habitation for hundreds of kilometres. These discoveries have fueled bold arguments. Perhaps the basin as a whole was once a patchwork of such networks, some dense, some more dispersed. Perhaps tens of thousands of settlements, from small hamlets to major regional centres, lay along rivers, on interfluvial plateaus, and in seasonally flooded plains. It is tempting, standing on the crest of one LiDAR-revealed road, or looking at a map stippled with ancient earthworks, to generalise, to imagine the entire Amazon as one vast continuous garden city, uniformly engineered from Andes to Atlantic. But the emerging picture is more complicated and more interesting than a simple, everywhere or nowhere. Even with new tools, there are large gaps. Some areas, especially those easiest to reach, or most threatened by development, have been scanned extensively. Others, including parts of remote interfluvial forests, remain almost entirely unstudied. Where LIDAR and fieldwork have concentrated, earthworks and anthropogenic soils often appear abundant. Where they have not, we simply do not know. This uncertainty feeds into a set of lively and sometimes heated debates. One concerns density. How many people lived in these landscapes at their peak? Population estimates for pre-contact Amazonia vary dramatically. Some scholars favour numbers on the order of 8 to 10 million or more across the basin. Others argue for figures at the lower end, perhaps a few million, pointing out that not all soils are easily farmed and that many regions show little clear evidence, so far, of large-scale modifications. Another debate revolves around the word city. When we call an Upper Xingu cluster a garden city or speak of urbanism in the forest, what do we mean? These were not cities in the sense of stone-walled, tightly packed, permanently paved metropolises. They were spread out, threaded with forest, dependent on shifting mosaics of fields, orchards, fishing structures, and managed groves. Calling them cities can help highlight their complexity, their planning, their regional integration. But it can also smuggle in assumptions from old-world urbanism that do not quite fit. Rigid centralization, stark divides between urban and rural, clear city walls. Some researchers prefer terms like low-density urbanism, settlement clusters, or regional polities to signal that these were urban in social and political ways, integrated, hierarchical, organized, without erasing their ecological and spatial distinctiveness. A third axis of debate is distribution. Were the most elaborate earthworks and soils limited mainly to certain ecological zones, like fertile floodplains, specific interfluves, or old river terraces? Or were they common across a much wider range of environments, from white sand forests to upland plateaus? Different datasets point in different directions. Botanical ghost signatures of domestication appear widely, even where obvious earthworks are scarce. This suggests that while not every area had monumental ditches or vast raised fields, human management of the forest, through planting, selective harvesting, and controlled burning, may have been more pervasive than large earthworks alone imply. Behind these scientific debates lies another, quieter transformation. Archaeology itself is changing. For much of the 20th century, research in the Amazon was often conducted as if the forest were an empty stage and indigenous people were faint echoes. Expeditions dropped in, dug, and left, taking artifacts and stories away to distant museums and journals. That model is no longer acceptable. Today, many of the most important projects are collaborative from the beginning. Indigenous communities, whose territories encompass ancient sites, are not just informants or stakeholders. They are co-researchers, co-authors, and in many cases the ones initiating inquiries. Elders' knowledge of sacred places, old paths, and traditional planting grounds can guide LIDAR interpretation and field surveys. Oral histories may preserve memories of earthworks as ancestor sites, or of certain groves as the work of culture heroes. Archaeological findings, in turn, can support land claims by documenting deep, continuous occupation. Ethical practice also means protecting sites from the harms that come with fame. A geoglyph that appears in a dramatic LIDAR image or a viral article can attract looters and souvenir hunters. Logging roads cut into new areas can expose fragile features before archaeologists or local communities have a chance to document or safeguard them. Some teams now keep the exact coordinates of sensitive sites confidential, sharing detailed locations only with trusted local partners and authorities. Others work with communities to develop management plans, where ancient earthworks are treated not as obstacles to development, but as heritage to be cared for. These choices matter because the story of the ancient Amazon is not only about the past, it is entangled with arguments about the present and future. If the forest was shaped, managed, and partly built by millions of people over millennia, then the simplistic contrast between pristine wilderness and modern development collapses. Recognizing ancient stewardship challenges narratives that portray indigenous land use as inherently destructive, or conversely, that insist the only way to save the Amazon is to remove people from it. Instead, the past suggests a more nuanced possibility. Large human populations once lived here while maintaining, and in some cases enhancing, biodiversity and soil fertility. They did it through systems of agroforestry, fish management, mosaic burning, and settlement planning that are still partially remembered and practiced by their descendants. This does not mean we can simply copy those systems at industrial scale, or that they were free of conflict and ecological strain. But it does mean that the forest we call natural is, in many places, already a cultural artifact, a long-term collaboration between humans and other species. In contemporary debates over deforestation, land rights and climate change, this matters. When indigenous groups argue that their territories are not just homes but archives, places where knowledge is embedded in soils, species and sacred sites, they are not speaking in metaphors. They are pointing to the same layered history that lidar, pollen and pottery sherds are beginning to trace. And still, for all the new tools, for all the lines and shapes that have emerged from the green, the unknowns remain vast. How many earthwork complexes still lie under unscanned forest, their ditches softened, their plazas roofed by second or third growth? How many terra preta patches, each representing centuries of daily life, wait in soils no one has yet sampled? How many stories of floods, migrations and forest making live only in languages with few remaining speakers, or in patterns of trees planted by hands that never wrote their names? The Amazon is no longer the empty wilderness of old maps, nor is it a solved puzzle. It is a palimpsest, a manuscript written, erased and written over again in charcoal and clay and chlorophyll. As we learn to read its faint lines, with lasers, with microscopes, with listening, another question quietly takes shape under the leaves. How many worlds, built and abandoned, still rest there in the dark soil, waiting for someone someday to notice the first small clue? If you step back from all of this, lidar beams, pollen grains, soil chemistry, oral histories, and let the pieces settle, a different Amazon slowly comes into view. Not an untouched void waiting for outsiders, not a single, unified empire marching in lockstep, something in between and all around. A vast, living mosaic of human-made soils and tended forests, of riverine towns and hilltop enclosures, of orchards that look like wild jungle and fish weirs that masquerade as ordinary rapids. A cultural landscape, layered and relayered by millions of hands over thousands of years. In that sense, the people of the ancient Amazon did not simply vanish. Words like disappearance and collapse are blunt tools. They suggest a neat ending where history simply stops. What happened here was messier and more human. Disease swept through after 1492, and slaving raids and forced relocations. Whole polities came apart. Some languages fell silent. Great roads overgrew. Fields went back to forest. Populations crashed by orders of magnitude. But some people fled instead of dying, carrying seeds and stories upriver, into tributaries, into deeper forest. Some were absorbed into other groups. Some quietly reoccupied small parts of their old territories when the worst had passed. Knowledge folded itself into ritual, into songs, into the way a garden is planted or a canoe is carved. And the forest itself became an archive. Roots pushed through abandoned streets and plazas, but the street grids still faintly guide the way rainwater drains. Sabre trees rooted in old house mounds pull nutrients from black earth made by kitchen fires that burned 1,000 years ago. Groves of Brazil nut, cacao, peach palm and dozens of other useful species stand where someone once chose them, protected them, favoured their seedlings over others. To a hasty eye, they are just jungle. To a careful one, they are orchards in disguise. Underfoot, shards of broken pots crackle in riverbanks after a storm. Charcoal flecks lie in deep soil horizons, where they have no business being if this were truly untouched forest. Everywhere, the traces persist. The Amazon we see today is not the opposite of civilization. It is what a certain kind of civilization looks like after the forest has had time to grow over it. A civilization of leaves and rivers, of memory stored in species and soils rather than in stone. When you listen to the rain on the canopy, you are hearing it fall on ancient fields, ancient roads, ancient villages whose names we may never know. Somewhere a child wakes in a stilt house over black water, learning from grandparents how to burn a garden without killing the forest, how to read the flood pulse of a river, how to call fish with a certain plant. They are not survivals of a vanished world. They are that world continued. As you drift towards sleep, you might let yourself imagine this other Amazon, half visible beneath the one on the maps. Long, straight causeways now lined with towering trees, hilltop enclosures whose ditches are softened into gentle rings, filled with shade and bird calls. An invisible lattice of human intention, entwined with roots and vines, still shaping which fruits appear along a path, which fish throng in a channel at the right season. The forest does not speak in our language, but it remembers. If you've enjoyed wandering through that memory tonight, and you'd like more slow history to fall asleep to, you can help this little project continue. You can tap like, so the algorithm knows this kind of calm storytelling matters. You can subscribe, so future journeys into other lost landscapes and forgotten peoples find their way back to you. If you feel awake enough, you're invited to leave a comment before you drift off. Where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? It's always strangely beautiful to see those little dots of time and place appear under the video. A quiet reminder of our own global web of rivers and roads, flickering screens in the dark. And if these deep time mysteries have really caught your curiosity, there is also a book. It's about prehistoric secrets and hidden worlds like this one, written in the same gentle, story-first style as these episodes. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com. However you choose to travel on from here, book, video, or just your own thoughts, the invitation is the same. The next time you picture the Amazon, let it be not a blank green void, but a palimpsest of lives. A place where cities once breathed under the trees and where, in some quiet way, they still do.